I drove to my best friend's lake cabin to surprise her for the weekend. The moment I pulled into the driveway, my heart sank. My husband's SUV was parked right outside. He was supposed to be in Chicago. I quietly walked up to the window and looked inside, and in 1 second, I wished I had never come. My name is Emily Parker, and until that Friday afternoon, I believed I had built the kind of life my mother would have been proud of. Not perfect, because no marriage is perfect, but decent. Steady coffee before sunrise, bills paid on time, Sunday calls to family, and a husband who kissed the top of my head in the kitchen. Grant was 44, handsome in that polished corporate way that made people trust him before he had earned it. He wore navy suits, drove a black Lincoln SUV, and knew how to make a room feel safe. I used to think that was charm. Later, I would understand it was practice. Sarah Whitmore had been my best friend since college. She had sat beside me at my mother's funeral, stood at my wedding, and cried harder than I did. So, when she said she was going to her lake cabin near Monaca to clear her head after her divorce, I believed her. No lawyers, no family, no men, no drama. She said, just pine trees and bad wine. I decided to surprise her. I packed cheese, crackers, 2 bottles of Pinot Noir, peanut butter pretzels, and one ridiculous murder mystery game we never finished. I left Milwaukee around noon after Grant kissed me in the garage and told me to drive safe. He had a carry-on by the door. Chicago conference. He said, 2 nights, regional leadership meeting. He complained about hotel coffee and airport sandwiches. Text me when you get there, he said, tapping the roof of my Subaru twice. I will, I said. The drive north was beautiful in that ordinary Midwestern way. Gray barns leaned against open fields. Gas stations advertised beef jerky and bait. The sky stretched pale over the highway. I stopped once in Wausau for coffee and called Sarah, but she did not answer. Reception was spotty. By the time I reached the cabin road, the afternoon had turned cold and golden. Sarah's place sat at the end of a gravel driveway, tucked behind pines with a small porch and a green metal roof. I remember smiling as I turned in, thinking she would scream when she saw me. Then I saw the SUV, black Lincoln, Wisconsin plates, small dent on the rear bumper from where Grant had backed into our trash bins the previous winter. For a moment, my mind built excuses faster than my heart could reject them. Maybe his company had rented the same model. Maybe someone else had the same dent. Maybe Grant had come to see Sarah because what? Because my husband, supposedly in Chicago, had driven north and parked outside my best friend's cabin. I pulled behind a stand of pine trees instead of beside the house. My hands were suddenly so cold they felt separate from me. I turned off the engine and sat there listening to the car tick as it cooled. A braver woman might have marched to the front door. A normal wife might have called. But betrayal has a way of making your body smarter than your pride. Something quiet inside me said, do not announce yourself. So I opened my door carefully and left the tote bag behind. A lamp glowed in the living room. The curtains were mostly drawn except for a narrow gap where the fabric had caught on the sill. I moved toward it slowly, each step taking me out of my old life and into a colder one. At first, all I saw was Sarah. She stood near the fireplace in a cream sweater I had complimented 2 weeks earlier, holding a wine glass. Then Grant stepped into view, not in a suit, not at a conference. He was wearing jeans and the charcoal sweater I had bought him last Christmas. His hand moved to the small of Sarah's back with the ease of habit, not accident, not comfort, habit. She turned toward him, and he kissed her like he had done it 100 times before. Not frantic, not guilty, familiar. But the worst part was not the kiss. The worst part was my stepfather, Richard Hale, sitting at the dining table with a pen in his hand. Richard had raised me from the time I was 12 after my father died, and my mother remarried the only man who made our house feel safe again. He was 72 now, a retired developer with a bad knee and a soft voice. In the past year, he had become forgetful, so I had started helping with bills and doctor's appointments. Across from him sat a woman in a blazer with a stack of documents. Grant pointed to a page. Right there, Grant said. Just initial where she marked it. Richard frowned. Emily should probably look at this first. Sarah's smile disappeared. Grant's voice softened into the tone he used when he wanted people to feel foolish for resisting him. Emily worries too much. Rich, this is just cleanup. It protects everyone. The woman slid another page forward. Mr. Hale, this amendment updates authority if Emily is unavailable or emotionally unable to act in your best interest. Emotionally unable. Richard shook his head. Emily is not unstable. No one said unstable. Sarah replied gently. But grief changes people. She's been overwhelmed for a long time. My mother had been dead 6 years. Then Grant said the sentence that changed the rest of my life. Once he signs, she loses the power to interfere. By the time she figures it out, the lake parcels will already be transferred. I backed away from the window without making a sound. I reached my car, locked the doors, and looked at my phone. Grant had texted 20 minutes earlier. Made it to Chicago. Long day already. Love you. I opened my camera roll and checked the video I had started recording without realizing it. The screen was shaky, the audio imperfect, but Grant's voice was there. Once he signs, she loses the power to interfere. I sat in that cold car outside my best friend's lake cabin with my husband's light glowing on my phone and Richard trapped inside with people he trusted. And for the first time in my marriage, I did not feel like crying. I felt still. Dangerously still. Emily used to tell me that shock came with tears. She was wrong. Shock came with silence. I sat in my Subaru until the sun slipped lower behind the pine trees. My hand still wrapped around the steering wheel. My breathing had slowed, but everything inside me felt strangely disconnected, as though my mind had stepped outside my body to watch someone else's life fall apart. Grant's text still glowed on my screen. Made it to Chicago. Long day already. Love you. For the first time in 12 years of marriage. Those 3 words looked less like affection and more like evidence. I resisted every instinct telling me to storm into the cabin. I wanted answers. I wanted Sarah to explain herself. I wanted Grant to look me in the eye while he lied. But another voice, quieter and steadier, reminded me of what I had just witnessed. Richard was inside. If I exploded now, they would have time to destroy documents, change their stories, and convince Richard that I had simply overreacted after discovering the affair, whatever those papers actually were. I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Grant had lied about Chicago. That alone meant I couldn't trust anything else. I placed my phone on the passenger seat and drove away without turning on the radio. By the time I reached the highway, dusk had settled over northern Wisconsin. Headlights stretched endlessly in front of me, while my mind replayed the same few seconds over and over again. Grant's hand resting comfortably against Sarah's back. Their kiss. Richard looking confused. The unfamiliar attorney laying documents across the table and Grant's words. Once he signs, she loses the power to interfere. I didn't yet know what power meant, but I intended to find out. Instead of driving home, I pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour grocery store in Wausau. The bright fluorescent lights and ordinary shoppers pushing carts somehow made the world feel normal again, even though mine had completely changed. I bought a bottle of water I didn't drink. Then I made my first phone call. Not to Grant, not to Sarah, to my attorney. Melissa Donovan had handled my mother's probate 6 years earlier. She specialized in estate planning and elder law, and she was one of the few people I trusted to tell me uncomfortable truths. She answered after the 3rd ring. Emily, I'm sorry to call this late. What's wrong? I looked through the windshield before answering. I think I just discovered my husband is having an affair. Melissa was quiet for a moment. I'm so sorry. I also walked in on what looked like some kind of meeting involving my stepfather and legal paperwork. That changed her tone immediately. What kind of paperwork? I honestly don't know. Did Richard seem confused? Yes. Did anyone pressure him to sign? I didn't stay long enough to know. She paused again. Emily, don't confront anyone tonight. I wasn't planning to. Good. Tomorrow morning. Come to my office. Bring everything you remember. Every text message. Every photo. Every recording. Don't assume anything yet. We need facts. I recorded part of the conversation. Keep multiple copies. I will. And Emily? Yes. If Richard is becoming forgetful, we need to make sure someone is looking out for his interests as well. After hanging up, I finally cried, not because of Grant, because Richard had looked so trusting. I reached Milwaukee, close to midnight. Grant still wasn't home. Of course, he wasn't. I unlocked the front door and stood inside our quiet house. His running shoes were by the entryway. His favorite coffee mug sat in the sink. His jacket still hung beside mine. Every ordinary object suddenly felt dishonest. I walked upstairs, opened our bedroom closet, and stared at the empty space where his suitcase had been that morning. He really had packed, just not for Chicago. My phone buzzed. Grant, how's your evening? I stared at the message for nearly a minute. Then I typed back, pretty quiet. Hope your meetings are going well. He responded almost instantly. Long day. I'll call tomorrow. I closed my eyes. He wasn't even hesitating anymore. The next morning, Melissa's office smelled exactly as I remembered. Fresh coffee and old law books. She listened without interrupting while I described everything in precise, chronological order. When I finished, she folded her hands across her desk. First, she said, your marriage and Richard's legal affairs are two separate issues. Don't let your anger about one cloud your judgment about the other. I nodded. I understand. Second, based on what you've told me, we don't know whether those documents were legitimate or not. We simply know there was a meeting you weren't aware of. So what do? We verify. Melissa outlined a careful, lawful plan. Richard needed to be contacted privately. His existing estate documents should be reviewed. If he wished, he could have an independent attorney explain every document before signing anything in the future. No accusations, no assumptions, just protection. People are free to change wills, trusts, and powers of attorney. She explained. The key question is whether those decisions are informed and voluntary. Her calmness steadied me. This wasn't about revenge yet. It was about making sure an elderly man wasn't making decisions without fully understanding them. Before I left, Melissa looked directly at me. Emily, there's something else. What if Grant has been lying about where he spends his time? Don't assume this began yesterday. Those words followed me all the way to my car because suddenly I remembered something Sarah had said months earlier. Richard still owns those lake properties, doesn't he? At the time it had sounded like harmless conversation. Now I wasn't so sure. I started my engine, knowing the affair I'd witnessed might only be one piece of a much larger betrayal. The first thing I did after leaving Melissa's office was not dramatic. I went to the grocery store. That may sound strange, but real life rarely waits politely while your world collapses. We still needed milk, coffee filters, and the low-sodium soup Richard liked to keep in his pantry. I walked the aisles with a basket hooked over my arm, nodding at a neighbor from church, pretending I was simply another woman deciding between chicken broth and vegetable stock. Inside, I was cataloging lies. Grant had lied about Chicago. Sarah had lied about being alone. Both of them had sat with Richard at a cabin, and whatever they were discussing involved his lake parcels. My authority and documents I had not been told about. By noon, I was standing on Richard's front porch with a grocery bag in each hand. His house was a brick ranch in Brookfield, the kind of solid, Carefully maintained home older Midwestern men love, because nothing about it tries too hard. My mother's hydrangeas still lined the walkway. Richard never had the heart to replace them, even though half of them bloomed unevenly now. He answered the door in slippers and a red flannel shirt. "Emily," he said, smiling as if nothing in the world was wrong. "Did I forget lunch?" "No," I said, forcing my voice to stay warm. "I was nearby." That was a lie, but it was the kind people tell when they are trying to protect someone. Inside, the kitchen smelled like toast. A crossword puzzle lay open on the table, only half finished. Richard shuffled around looking for mugs while I put the groceries away. "Did you have a good week?" I asked casually. He waved one hand. "Quiet. Sarah stopped by yesterday, though." My chest tightened. "At the house?" He frowned slightly. No. Up north. Her cabin." "You went to Sarah's cabin?" "I think so." He rubbed his temple. "Grant drove me. Said you knew." The milk carton almost slipped from my hand. I closed the refrigerator slowly. "Grant told you I knew." Richard looked embarrassed. "Didn't you?" I smiled because if I did not smile, I would have frightened him. "I just didn't realize it was yesterday." He sat down at the table, suddenly tired. "There were some papers. I didn't like them." "What kind of papers?" "I don't know. That's the trouble." He looked toward the window where the bare branches tapped faintly against the glass. "They kept saying it was routine. Sarah said you were under a lot of pressure, and Grant said it would make things easier if there was a backup." "A backup for what?" "For decisions." He looked at me then, his eyes clear enough to break my heart. "Emily, am I becoming a burden?" I crossed the kitchen and knelt beside his chair. "No," I said, "you are not a burden. Not to me." His hand found mine. "I didn't sign everything," he said quietly. "I signed one page, maybe two. Then I got a headache and I told them I wanted to go home." The room seemed to tilt, but I kept my face calm. "That was good," I said. "That was very good." He blinked. "Was it?" "Yes." When I left Richard's house, I called Melissa from the driveway. "He signed something," I said. "Do you know what?" "No." "Then we move faster." By late afternoon, Melissa had arranged for Richard to meet with an independent elder law attorney the next morning. Not her, because she wanted everything clean and defensible. She also recommended a medical evaluation, not as an insult to Richard, but as a safeguard. If anyone later claimed he was easily manipulated, we would need facts, not family opinions. That night, Grant came home. He kissed my cheek at the door. "Long weekend," he said, dropping his suitcase as if he had just returned from the exhausting conference he never attended. I was standing at the stove, stirring chili. It was one of his favorites with kidney beans he always pretended not to like and ate. "Anyway, how was Chicago?" I asked. He loosened his tie. "Same old bad coffee. Worse presentations. Did you see Mark from Regional?" A tiny pause. "Yeah, briefly." There was no Mark from Regional. I had made him up. I turned the heat lower. "That's nice." He came behind me and placed both hands on my shoulders. Once that gesture would have comforted me. Now it took every ounce of control not to step away. "You seem tense," he said, "just tired." His thumbs pressed lightly against my neck. "You work too hard." I almost laughed. Instead, I served dinner. We ate across from each other, like civilized strangers. He told me a fake story about a hotel clerk losing his reservation. I asked ordinary questions. He answered smoothly. Every lie landed between us like another brick in a wall he could not see me building. After dinner, while he showered, I checked our shared phone bill, not because I expected anything obvious, but because people who believe they are smarter than everyone else often get careless in small, stupid ways. Sarah's number appeared again and again. Late nights, early mornings, calls during times Grant claimed to be at the gym, in meetings, or driving home from work. Then I found something worse. A recurring charge on our credit card from a property management company in northern Wisconsin. It had been hidden among business expenses for 6 months, not large enough to start a fight, just large enough to matter. I took screenshots and emailed them to myself. The next morning, Richard met the independent attorney. By lunch, Melissa called me. Her voice was controlled but tense. Emily, Richard remembers being asked to sign a document naming Grant and Sarah as secondary decision makers if you were considered unable to serve. My mouth went dry. Sarah, yes, she's not family. No, she is not. I stood in the hallway outside my office, watching coworkers walk past with coffee cups and laptops, living in a normal Tuesday I no longer belonged to. Melissa continued, the attorney is requesting copies of anything Richard signed. We're also notifying his financial institutions that no changes should be processed without direct confirmation from Richard through independent counsel. So, they can't just push this through? Not quietly. That word stayed with me. Quietly, because that was how Grant had operated for years. Quiet dinners, quiet lies, quiet hands on my shoulders while he moved pieces behind my back. But he had made one mistake. He had assumed I would fall apart. That evening, I opened an old box in the guest room closet, the one marked wedding. Inside were photographs, cards, dried flowers, and the original program from the day Sarah stood beside me in a pale blue dress, smiling as I married the man she had already known too well. At the bottom of the box was a photo from the rehearsal dinner. Grant, Sarah, and me. I had never noticed it before. In the picture, Sarah was not looking at the camera. She was looking at him, and Grant was smiling back. After I found that photograph, I stopped looking for coincidence. For years, I had explained away the little things because that is what people do when they love someone. We smooth over rough edges. We choose the kinder interpretation. We tell ourselves that friendship, marriage, and family deserve the benefit of the doubt. Now I looked at everything differently, not through anger, through evidence. The next morning, I met Melissa before work. She already had a legal pad filled with notes. Richard's independent attorney reviewed the documents he remembers signing. She said, fortunately, none of the major trust amendments have been processed. I released a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. But there was always a but. Why do someone prepare a package that would have significantly reduced your role in his financial and medical decisions if additional documents had been executed? So, they weren't finished. No. Melissa folded her hands. Emily, this is important. We still don't know whether Grant believed everything being presented was legally appropriate or whether he knowingly participated in something improper. Intent matters. I appreciated that about her. She refused to jump ahead of the facts. So, we stick to facts, I said. She smiled faintly. Exactly. Richard agreed to undergo a comprehensive cognitive evaluation the following week. Not because anyone wanted to prove he was incapable. Quite the opposite. He wanted an independent medical record establishing exactly what he could and could not understand. I've spent 40 years making my own decisions, he told the physician with quiet dignity. I'd like to keep doing that. The evaluation showed what Emily had already suspected. Richard had mild memory impairment consistent with normal aging. He was still fully capable of making his own decisions as long as complex legal documents were explained carefully and independently. That single report changed everything. It meant nobody could honestly claim Richard was incapable. It also meant nobody should be rushing him through complicated paperwork. At home, Grant behaved as though nothing had changed. He made coffee every morning. He complained about traffic. He watched baseball after dinner. Sometimes I caught him studying me for an extra second, perhaps wondering why I seemed quieter than usual. If he was suspicious, he never showed it. Instead, he became almost excessively attentive. You've been working too much, he said one evening while loading the dishwasher. I've been busy. We should get away next month. Maybe a cabin somewhere. The word landed like ice water. A cabin? He shrugged. Just us. I looked at him across the kitchen. There had been a time when I would have believed this was guilt. Now I wondered whether he simply wanted to know how much I suspected. Melissa advised patience. Don't accuse anyone until we've secured Richard's interests. So that became our priority. Richard met with his attorney twice more. Together, they reviewed every existing estate document, every trust, every power of attorney, every beneficiary designation. Nothing was changed without Richard fully understanding it. Several outdated authorizations were revoked and replaced with newly drafted documents that clearly reflected his wishes. This time there would be no confusion, no shortcuts, no private meetings at remote cabins. Richard insisted on one additional protection. I want Emily present whenever major decisions are discussed, he said. His attorney nodded. That's entirely your choice. Richard smiled. It always was. Meanwhile, I quietly began preparing for another conversation. Not with Grant, with Sarah. She called twice during the week. I let both calls go to voicemail. Her messages sounded almost rehearsed. Hey, Em. Just checking in. Miss you. We should do lunch. I listened to them without responding. The woman whose voice had once meant comfort now sounded like a stranger borrowing someone else's memories. Friday evening, Grant announced that another conference had appeared on his calendar. Cedar Rapids. This time, he said casually while scrolling through his phone. When? Next Thursday. I nodded. Have fun. His eyes lifted from the screen. That's it. What? No lecture about traveling. I smiled politely. You've earned my trust. The words seemed to satisfy him. He smiled back. I knew you'd understand. After he went upstairs, I sat alone in the living room and stared at the wedding photograph still resting on the coffee table. Trust. That had become the cruelest word in our marriage. The following Monday, Melissa called with another update. We received copies of the draft documents. Were they legal? They were professionally prepared. My stomach tightened. But the proposed changes would have transferred substantial decision-making authority away from you under specific circumstances. And Sarah. She appeared as an alternate in one section. I closed my office door. Why would Richard ever choose Sarah? He says he wouldn't. Silence settled between us. Finally, Melissa spoke again. Emily, regardless of anyone's motives, Richard has now confirmed those drafts do not reflect his intentions. That mattered. It meant Richard himself, not me, was rejecting the proposed changes. That evening, Richard invited me to dinner. We ordered takeout from his favorite Italian restaurant and ate on the back patio overlooking the garden my mother had planted years earlier. The summer flowers were beginning to fade. Richard poured iced tea into 2 glasses. I've been thinking about what? About your mother. I smiled. I miss her, too. He looked toward the flower beds. She used to tell me that character isn't revealed when life is easy. He paused. It's revealed when someone believes nobody is watching. I knew he wasn't talking only about himself. He had begun putting the pieces together. Not every detail, but enough. I trusted Grant. He admitted quietly. So did I. He reached across the table and rested his weathered hand over mine. I'm sorry. You have nothing to apologize for. I brought him into more family conversations than I should have. You treated him like a son. Richard nodded sadly. I think he enjoyed being treated that way. Driving home, I realized something unexpected. For days, I had imagined revenge as a single explosive moment, a confrontation, a confession, a dramatic ending. Instead, it looked very different. It looked like protecting Richard before irreversible damage could occur. It looked like careful documentation instead of accusations. It looked like patience. Grant still believed he controlled the narrative. Sarah still believed I knew nothing. Neither of them understood that the foundation beneath their plans had already shifted. Richard's interests were protected. Independent records existed. The questionable proposals had been identified and rejected. Every important decision would now pass through people whose only loyalty was to the law and to Richard's clearly expressed wishes. For the first time since that afternoon outside the lake cabin, I allowed myself to believe something I hadn't dared think before. Whatever Grant and Sarah had hoped to accomplish, they were already too late. For the next 2 weeks, nothing happened, or at least that was how it appeared on the surface. Grant still left for work every morning at 7:30 with a travel mug of coffee in one hand and his laptop bag in the other. Sarah continued posting carefully curated photos on social media. Sunsets over the lake, homemade bread, a rescued golden retriever she claimed to be fostering. If someone had stumbled across our lives online, they would have seen nothing but ordinary people living ordinary lives. But beneath that calm surface, the ground had shifted. Richard's attorney had formally documented his wishes. His financial advisor had been instructed that no significant changes were to be made without a face-to-face meeting with Richard and independent legal counsel present. Melissa had organized every piece of information I had gathered into a chronological file. Not because we were preparing for a lawsuit, because facts mattered. Emotion faded. Facts remained. One Thursday afternoon, Richard called. Emily. Hi, Richard. I'd like to have a family birthday dinner next Saturday. I smiled. His birthday was still a week away. You want to celebrate early? I do. Anyone special you want me to invite? There was a brief pause. Everyone. When I arrived at Richard's house the following Saturday, the dining room looked exactly as it had during dozens of family holidays over the years. The oak table had been extended. My mother's china sat neatly arranged beside polished silverware. A chocolate cake rested in the center of the table beneath a glass dome. Nothing about the evening suggested confrontation. That was intentional. Richard greeted each guest warmly. Grant arrived carrying an expensive bottle of wine. Sarah followed 20 minutes later with flowers. She hugged me. For a split second, I almost forgot everything. She still smelled like the same lavender perfume she had worn since college. Then I remembered the cabin, the kiss, the lies. Emily, she said softly, it's been too long. It has. Grant slipped an arm around my shoulders. You okay? I'm fine. You seem quiet. I've been listening more lately. He laughed, assuming I meant work. I meant him. Dinner began peacefully. Richard talked about fishing trips from 30 years earlier. Grant told a story about a difficult client. Sarah complimented the roast chicken. If anyone had walked past the dining room window, they would have believed they were looking at an ordinary family gathering. Halfway through dessert, Richard set down his fork. I'd like everyone's attention. The room fell silent. I've spent the last several weeks reviewing my estate plans. Grant smiled politely. That's smart. Richard nodded. It was overdue. He looked first at me, then at Grant, then at Sarah. I've also spent a great deal of time thinking about trust. Nobody spoke. Richard continued calmly. I recently attended a meeting at Sarah's lake cabin. Grant's smile disappeared. Sarah lowered her eyes. I went because people I cared about assured me it was routine. Richard reached beside his chair and lifted a folder. I later discovered I did not fully understand what I was being asked to sign. Grant leaned forward. Richard, if there's been some misunderstanding. Richard gently raised one hand. I'm speaking. Grant stopped. I met afterward with independent counsel. He glanced toward the living room as recommended. At that moment, Melissa stepped into the dining room. Behind her came Richard's attorney, Daniel Brooks. Grant stared at them. What is this? Richard answered before anyone else could. A conversation that should have happened before anyone asked me to sign legal documents. Sarah looked visibly pale. Richard, I never wanted you to feel pressured. I appreciate that. His voice remained remarkably gentle. But intention and effect are not always the same. Daniel placed several documents on the table. Mister. Hale has completed a full review of his estate planning, he said evenly. All prior draft amendments that did not reflect his wishes have been withdrawn. Grant looked at me. You knew about this? Yes. When? Since the day I visited the cabin. His expression changed instantly. You were there. I saw enough. Silence settled over the room. Grant finally spoke. You think this is about an affair? I met his eyes. I know there was one. Sarah closed hers. Neither of them denied it. Not once. Grant rubbed both hands across his face. It wasn't supposed to happen. I almost laughed at the absurdity of the sentence. Affairs never were. But it did. I replied quietly. He nodded. Yes. Richard looked older than he had a month earlier. Not physically. Emotionally. I welcomed you into my family, he said to Grant. I know. I trusted you. I know. Richard turned toward Sarah. And I loved you like another daughter. Tears rolled down her cheeks. I'm sorry. I believe you are. He paused. But being sorry doesn't undo broken trust. Melissa opened the folder. Emily recorded part of the meeting from outside the cabin. Grant's head snapped toward me. You recorded us? I didn't know what I was seeing. Daniel spoke calmly. The recording was not used to accuse anyone of criminal conduct. It simply confirmed that significant legal decisions were being discussed without Emily's knowledge, and that Mr. Hale himself expressed uncertainty. Richard nodded. I remember saying Emily should look at the papers. You did, I answered. And nobody listened. Grant's shoulders slumped. For the first time since I had met him, he looked like a man who understood that confidence could not repair consequences. Richard folded his hands. I've made several decisions. Nobody interrupted. My attorneys, advisors, and physicians will continue assisting me. Daniel nodded. Of course. My estate planning now reflects exactly what I want. He looked directly at Grant. You will have no future role in managing my personal or financial affairs. Grant swallowed. I understand. Richard turned toward Sarah. And while I sincerely hope you rebuild your life, I will no longer involve you in private family matters. She quietly whispered. I understand. No shouting. No insults. No dramatic accusations. Only consequences. Sometimes they were heavier than anger. As the evening ended, guests left one by one. Grant remained in the driveway beside me. The autumn air had turned cold. I did love you, he said quietly. I studied his face for a long moment. I think part of you probably did. And that's all you have to say. I looked toward the warm light shining through Richard's front window. The man I married would never have lied about Chicago. Grant lowered his eyes. The man I married would never have let me discover the truth through a window. He had no answer. Neither did I. I walked to my car without looking back, knowing the hardest conversation of my life was still waiting. The conversation that would finally end our marriage. I slept in the guest room that night, not because Grant asked me to, because I needed one final evening to say goodbye to the life I had believed was real. The next morning, the house felt unfamiliar. The coffee maker clicked on automatically at 6 o'clock, just as it had every weekday for years. Grant came downstairs wearing jeans and a faded sweatshirt, carrying 2 mugs out of habit. He stopped when he saw my suitcase by the front door. So, this is really happening. Yes. He set 1 mug on the counter without touching it. I don't want to fight. I don't either. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he looked at me with tired eyes. Was there ever a point where you thought we could fix this? I answered honestly. If I'd only discovered the affair, maybe I would have tried. His shoulders sagged. But you lied about everything else, too. You looked me in the eye, kissed me goodbye, told me you loved me, and drove to that cabin. You helped arrange legal meetings with Richard without telling me whether you believed those documents were appropriate or not. You chose secrecy over honesty. He closed his eyes. I know. Marriage can't survive that. There was nothing left to argue. Sometimes the end of a marriage wasn't marked by screaming. Sometimes it ended with two people quietly acknowledging that trust had already left long before either of them did. The divorce moved forward over the following months. Wisconsin's process required patience, paperwork, and more waiting than television dramas ever admitted. We divided our shared assets fairly, sold the house, and went our separate ways. There was no courtroom spectacle, no shouting across a judge's bench, no last-minute confession, just signatures, boxes, moving trucks, a life carefully taken apart. Grant never challenged the division. His attorney described him as cooperative, and I appreciated that. Whatever mistakes he had made, dragging out the divorce would only have created more damage. The chapter ended with dignity. Even if it had begun with betrayal, Richard recovered more than I expected. The independent medical evaluation gave him confidence rather than fear. Instead of worrying that occasional forgetfulness meant he was losing himself, he learned practical ways to stay organized. His physician adjusted a few medications, recommended memory exercises, and encouraged him to remain socially active. He even joined a local woodworking group. "I've built houses for 40 years," he joked one afternoon. "Now I'm making birdhouses. They were beautiful, uneven in places, perfect in the ways that mattered." Every important legal decision continued to be reviewed carefully with his attorney present, exactly as Richard wanted. He often reminded people that asking for independent advice wasn't a sign of weakness. "It protects everyone," he would say, "especially the people you love." Sarah wrote me 3 letters. The first arrived 2 weeks after the birthday dinner. She apologized, not with excuses, not by blaming Grant. She admitted that the affair had begun long before I suspected anything. She admitted she had convinced herself that because my marriage already had problems, she wasn't truly taking anything away from me. Reading those words hurt more than I expected. People rarely destroy friendships in a single moment. They justify one small betrayal after another until they no longer recognize themselves. I never answered. The second letter explained that she had resigned from the real estate brokerage where she had worked for nearly 15 years. Her managing broker had learned about the situation through community gossip, and although her personal life was her own, she felt she had lost the trust necessary to continue serving clients effectively. The third letter simply wished Richard good health and thanked him for the kindness he had shown her over the years. I gave that one to him unopened. He read it quietly, then placed it in a drawer. Some wounds deserved privacy. Grant changed jobs before the divorce was finalized. He told me during one of our final meetings with the mediator that remaining at the same company had become too difficult. Too many reminders. He said, I believed him. Actions have consequences beyond legal documents and financial settlements. They change how people see themselves when they wake up in the morning. Whether he eventually found peace was no longer my responsibility. I genuinely hoped he would, just somewhere far away from the life we had once shared. Almost a year after the afternoon at the lake cabin, Richard invited me north again. I think it's time, he said over the phone. This time we drove together, not to Sarah's cabin, to a small lakeside cottage I had recently purchased with money from the sale of my half of the marital home. It wasn't large. 1 bedroom, a screened porch, a weathered dock stretching into clear water. The first morning there, I woke before sunrise and carried 2 mugs of coffee outside. The lake was perfectly still. Mist floated across the surface, while loons called somewhere in the distance. Richard sat beside me without speaking. After several quiet minutes, he smiled. You know what? I spent months blaming myself. So did I. He nodded thoughtfully. But here's what I finally realized. I waited. Trusting decent people isn't foolish. He looked out across the water. What's dangerous is refusing to believe they're no longer decent after they've shown you the truth. I felt tears sting my eyes, not from sadness, from relief. Because he was right. The betrayal had not defined us. Our response to it had. Sometimes people ask whether I regret driving to that cabin. Whether I wish I had turned around the moment I saw Grant's SUV, the honest answer is still yes. Part of me wishes I had never looked through that window because what I saw shattered my marriage, ended my closest friendship, and permanently changed how I understood trust. But another part of me knows something equally true. If I had driven away without looking, I might have spent years living inside a beautiful lie. Truth is painful. Deception is worse. Losing people who betray you hurts. Losing yourself while protecting their lies hurts far more. If this story leaves you with anything, I hope it's this: love deeply, trust generously, but never surrender your judgment simply because someone has earned your affection. Healthy relationships welcome honesty, transparency, and accountability. The people who truly love you will never ask you to ignore your instincts in order to protect their secrets. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story moved you, reminded you of someone, or gave you something to think about, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about resilience, justice, and finding strength after betrayal, please consider subscribing and joining us for the next journey.